Welcome to the third video on ancient Greece. Today we are going to be examining the Homeric legends and the Greek Dark Ages. The Greek Dark Ages occurred shortly after the collapse of Mycenaean Greece. But before we get into the Dark Ages, I would like to spend a little time here discussing Homer. So in terms of Homer, and there his bust is down on the right hand side, this is really a difficult topic for many scholars. Now you'll notice that one question is missing here, and that question would be, do the cities described by Homer really exist? Before I answer that, here is a little context. Now, before the late 19th century, it was pretty much the consensus the events described in the Iliad and the Odyssey did not occur. But that was before a German named Heinrich Schliemann decided he was going to actually go to Turkey and see if this stuff really existed. And lo and behold, through a lot of digging, he found Troy and other cities that were described by Homer. Even more amazingly, many of the palaces and buildings were very similar to what Homer described. So since then, these finds have been confirmed, and more importantly, there is pretty much a consensus that these cities did in fact exist. That ended the controversy, but usually when you end one controversy, you start another one. And that begs the question, if the cities existed, are the events that surround them true as well? I think this is difficult because many legends are carried down orally, so they have a tendency to get distorted and exaggerated as they come down through the ages. Still, it would be very naive on our part to discount legends completely, just as it would be equally absurd to say they are 100% accurate. It is usually safer to come somewhere down in the middle, and that is essentially the case for most Greek scholars on the subject of Homer. If there is some agreement on the events now, there is even less consensus on when all of this transpired. And that's why I chose to put this at the start of the Greek Dark Ages, because it could be part of Mycenaean Greece, or it could be part of the Greek Dark Ages. And that's essentially how it works. Some of the experts will say, no, could not have occurred in Mycenaean Greece. It had to have been in the Greek Dark Ages and vice versa. Still, others will take this almost up to the time of classical Greece. So again, there's a lot of debate and no easy answers in the absence of written historical records. The other question you'll see is Homer the author. This might be the silliest of all the debates because I might ask the question, does it really matter? After all, it's the story that counts here, just in the way it's Shakespeare's language that we marvel at, not whether Shakespeare really existed or he was someone else. So moving along here, let's take a look at the Greek Dark Ages timeline. And again, there's not a lot that's known about these Dark Ages because there are no written records. But we can generally say that it started between 1200 and 1100 BC and went all the way up to 800 BC, so approximately 400 years. And then the Dorian invasion occurred, now we have to put question marks around that, and we'll get to that later, occurred between 1100 BC and up to 950 BC. And then Homeric society, which we were just talking about 1000 BC to 800 BC. And of course, Homer was born in the late Dark Ages. Okay, so let's go ahead to the next slide now, and we move on to some tidbits here that I want to discuss about the Dark Ages. So the first question we always have to ask is, why do we call these the Dark Ages? Certainly the people living then might not have thought that. It's quite possible they lived a pastoral existence. But the term dark in historical context implies that a way of life was better than it is now. And it's sort of similar today if you think about it. How many times have you heard that the 50s were a much better decade than the 70s? And then people said the 80s was so much better than the 70s. And now people will say, gosh, the 90s and 80s were so much better than what's going on today. So there's always this idea that somehow it was better to live in the past. But today the term dark has fallen out of favor with historians because of the negative connotations it implies. And many are now referring to this period simply as the early Iron Age. In any event, the two keys during this time period are a loss of writing and a loss of cities, and that means no civilization. Writing was gone, and we have to assume that most people living in the Greek Dark Ages were illiterate. The loss of cities probably pushed people into a more nomadic lifestyle, a lifestyle of herding, and this is far different from the mass production of goods that the cities provided. In other words, your survival was dependent on the foods you collected for yourself, since there was no city out there providing anything to you. There was also undoubtedly a reduction in the population of mainland Greece. Now, we do see a much newer and better technology come about during this time period, and that is the introduction of iron metalworking, which eventually replaces bronze as the standard. Later in classical Greece, iron will be the default metal of choice to forge weapons. Okay, so let's go ahead and move to the Dorians in the next slide. So now we will discuss the Dorians. Here is the one fact we do know. The Dorians arrived at some point in the Peloponnesus. This occurred somewhere between 1100 and 950 BC, but again, there is no firm date as to when or how this transpired. So let's discuss the ancient version of how this went down. The ancient tradition tells us that the descendants of Hercules returned in order to reclaim land their ancestor Hercules had held in the Peloponnesus. So the question is this a Dorian invasion or is it a Dorian migration? And that is a very tough question. The consensus now is that the invasion story seems unlikely, and most would agree that this was probably a migration over a long period of time. A migration that saw the Dorians migrate into areas that were probably completely deserted after the Mycenaean collapse. In any event, the Dorians are the precursors to Sparta and many cities in the Peloponnesus. If you take a look at the map below, you can see the various dialects all around Greece. And it kind of represents the divisions that would occur in classical Greece. You can see that the Dorians pretty much had the Peloponnesus, and you can see the dialects that were spoken around Athens. So that's pretty much it for Homer and the Greek Dark Ages, and I will see you guys in the next video.